After a horrific 2023 African Cup of Nations where no North African teams even qualified to the quarterfinals, now we only have 2 North African clubs qualifying to the knockout stages of the 2024 African Champions League. Is North African football getting worse? That's the question we're going to try to answer today on the African Five-A-Side podcast. Hi, my name is Maher Mizahi. I'm your host of the African Five-A-Side podcast, brought to you by www.africasaCountry.com. Today we're going to be talking about the state of North African football, because the dominant discourse online right now is that North African football is taking a dip. As we spoke about at the 2023 Afcon, teams like Algeria and Tunisia crashed out in the group stages. Egypt and Morocco, who were so good at the World Cup in 2022, they crashed out in the round of 16. What does that say? Is that something specific to North African teams playing in West Africa, or some might even say Sub-Saharan Africa? Or is there something else going on? I'm going to try to answer that question today and extend it also to the club sides, as only 2 clubs, El Ahly and Esperance de Tunis, qualified to the knockout stages of the 2024 African Champions League. So before we start talking about all of this, the current state of affairs, let's talk about historically. Why has North Africa historically been so successful in terms of proportion, right? We're talking about 5, 6, 7 countries. How have they been able to sort of almost outperform the rest of the continent, besides perhaps West Africa, which has obviously been very, very successful as well? There's a really short answer, and it has many elements to it, and that's proximity to Europe. The Europeans invented the game. They're the ones that exported the game to the African continent. And the fact that North Africa is geographically so close to Europe, that allowed for so much of a knowledge transfer that really gave North Africa a head start ahead of the rest of the continent. And that's unfortunate. Sometimes it's as straightforward as that. Take the case of, like a Morocco or Algeria or a Tunisia. These countries, because of their proximity to Europe, they're like the rest of the continent, they were colonized, but because of the proximity, there was a huge population transfer where you had many, people from Malta, Spain, Portugal, France, of course, coming and being colonial settlers in these countries. And they brought the game with them. And eventually the natives, as they did all across the continent, they started using football to sort of throw off the yoke of colonialism. But at the very beginning, they were learning the game. All of a sudden, they understood that this was a battleground that they could use to fight against the European ideas of colonization and everything. But prior to that, there was a proliferation of clubs all over the place. There were many, many Europeans that, grew up really in North Africa, played for North African clubs and became world-class players like Just Fontaine from Morocco. And if the natives and the indigenous and the locals were good enough, they would often go and play in Europe, as was the case for many, famous players like the Moroccan guy Al-Arabi bin Barak, like the Algerians Rachid Makhloufi or Mustafa Zitouni. Players that end up playing for the French national team and that were some of the best players prior to the decolonization of the African continent. So that proximity to Europe, that colonization was a horrible, horrible thing. It wasn't a net positive in any case, but some of the unintended positive effects is that there was that transfer of knowledge, and North African nations tended to benefit. So even when these countries became independent, they had a little bit of a head start compared to most of the rest of the continent. Even after colonization, now North African countries, due to their proximity with Europe, tend to benefit from the diaspora. So you have, 4 million Algerians living in France. You have so many Moroccans living in Spain and Holland and Belgium. And as a result, even if these countries are not producing enough talent at home, they can go look to those diasporas abroad. These kids that have, 2 nationalities and who are sometimes growing up in some of the best academies in European football. and they can go and pick, 4, 5, 6 of these players to integrate into the national team. And here I'm not just talking about, the Arab North African nations, but you can even look at a side like Cape Verde, and how much their diaspora is important for them. So many players, born and raised in Portugal, and how that's really helped them as a footballing nation as well. Finally, off the pitch, but in the stands, there's a cultural influence, of like ultras and the way they support their teams. If you go to a North African club match, it's not like going to a club match in South Africa or going to a club match in Nigeria or in Ghana. And the North Africans, the Mediterraneans in particular, I'm talking about, your Algeria, your Morocco, Tunisia. What they really understood and what they were influenced by was the Italian culture of the ultras, and creating that sort of home, intimidating atmosphere that you can see in so many North African stadiums. And them, especially at the club level, them adopting that gives them a big edge, especially when you have these two-legged formats, home and away, because it's very difficult to beat them at home. They intimidate the opposition, they intimidate the referees, and if a team is inexperienced, that's almost like a death knell for them. Some teams learned how to deal with that. Pizzo Mosimane was very good at that. Rulani Mokwena is also very good at that as well. Tipe Mezambi at a certain point learned how to master that and create their own intimidating atmosphere at home. But if you're inexperienced, that can really hurt you. And finally, strictly financial. Each of the 5 North African nations, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco, are top 15 economies on the African continent. Top 15 in terms of GDP, nominally and per capita. So again, straight economics sometimes can help as well. So I think that's why North Africa has outperformed the rest of the regions of the continent, except for maybe West Africa. So that's something to keep in mind. So that's why they've been pretty much successful, yeah? Now let's take a look at the recent results and try to explain them. And let's use a basic formula in football, yeah? Administration, which here I'm talking about the federation of the national team or a club. Administration plus coaching plus players plus a little bit of luck, that can equal success most of the time. Administration, coaching, players, and a little bit of luck. That's our formula, yeah? And money is the sort of rising tide that lifts all of those factors up, especially at the club level. If you have money, we talked about the top 15 economically, if you have money, you usually have a more competent administration, usually, not always the case. You usually have the money to pay a better coach, again, not always the case. And usually you can buy better players as well. With the national team, you can't really buy better players, but you can have a really good administration, really good coaching. Okay. Using this formula, let's review the North African team's performances at the African Cup of Nations and in the CAF Champions League. And before we start, one final reminder. Let's not forget that Mauritania is a North African nation. Mauritania is part of UNAF. They are part of the North African Football Union. And they had historic African Cup of Nations at the expense of Algeria. So we can't really say that they underperformed, right? Quite the opposite. So Morocco, from an administrative level, we can't say anything. They're probably top on the continent, right? This is a national team that was first in Cote d'Ivoire, the first ones to land there, to sort of prepare everything. Instead of going to what they call les cités Cannes, lodging provided by Cote d'Ivoire, the hosts. No, they go to a hotel, they renovate the entire hotel on their own bill, and then they get exclusivity for as long as they're in the city of San Pedro. So they bring their own chefs. Sometimes they bring their own, sheets and pillows. They'll bring everything over to make sure that they're in the best conditions. If there's anything missing in the hotel, months ahead of time, they're going to send people over there to build it and to renovate the hotel, so they can include things like hot tubs and swimming pools and, exercise equipment and so on and so forth. So administrative level, we can't say anything, right? Coaching, I think Walid Regragui is a very good coach, but I think his coaching at the African Cup of Nations was mediocre. And the players are good. We can't say anything about the players, even though they dealt with very crucial injuries. Nusser Mazaraoui at left back, but especially Hakim Ziyech as the right midfielder. Why was the coaching mediocre? It's not that the coach is mediocre again, but The main problem with Walid Regragui and Morocco at the 2023 African Cup of Nations is that they were too predictable. They were playing a 4-1-4-1, this exact same style of play that they played at the World Cup, the exact same style of play that they played throughout the calendar year of 2023. And they get to the Cup of Nations, and if you play a tactically astute team like South Africa, who, by the way, I would say they outplayed Morocco anyways, but tactically they were better than Morocco. And Walid Regragui, any coach that should see that after 45, 60 minutes needs to have a plan B. And we didn't really see him have a plan B, not just for that match against South Africa, but even in the second half against DR Congo when they started to, the momentum started to shift. So Morocco's main problem was that the coaching wasn't good enough. And I think there's been a general understanding of that in Morocco. They decided to extend Walid Regragui and to stick with him, but he's had to sort of, take off a lot of members of his staff, bring in new members of the staff, and people are expecting some changes in the way that they play and in sort of his playing style. So I don't think they don't want to fire him because of everything great that he did with Morocco and historic results that they had at the World Cup. But at the same time, they're sort of saying, okay, if you're going to stay on, we need to see a little bit better coaching. So coaching was the problem for Morocco. What about Algeria? Algeria did the same thing Morocco did. They went to a hotel. They refused the lodging from the host Cote d'Ivoire, which was in what they call a Cité Cannes, like dormitories for all the national teams. And they get a hotel right across from the stadium in Bouaké. Exact same thing, renovated and exclusive with security and a gate and a wall and nobody can get in. So administratively, I don't think anybody can complain. They played 3 friendly matches, the most friendly matches that any other national team played. So there was a lot of time for preparation. Yeah. So administratively, it was good. What about the coaching? My God. If Walid Regragui was predictable, then what do we say about Jamal Belmadi? He was the most predictable coach out of anybody at the Cup of Nations. He's been playing the exact same 4-3-3 since he won the Cup of Nations in 2019. And oh, by the way, that's the last time Algeria actually won a match at the African Cup of Nations. So the Mauritanian coach, Amir Abdou, said time and time again, we kind of knew what Algeria was going to do. We know who's going to be making the entry passes. He was saying it's supposed to be Nabil Ben Taleb, but then we realized since he wasn't playing, it's going to be Issa Mondi. It was just too predictable. And as a result, teams could set up against Algeria. And the coach, again, didn't really have a plan B. So I would even, if Regragui is mediocre because, okay, this was his first tournament and that he was predictable, Belmadi was bad because this is the second tournament that he was predictable. He did this in Cameroon. He did it when he lost against Cameroon in the World Cup playoff and then in Cote d'Ivoire. So coaching, bad. And the players, again, good. If you look at the squad of the Moroccan players or the Algerian players, there's no way you could say these teams shouldn't at least make the quarterfinals with the amount of talent on paper. So coaching was the problem for Algeria and Morocco. What about Tunisia? Tunisia's administration, if the other two were good, Tunisia's administration is horrible. The federation president is in jail. Them and Mali, yeah. Federation president is in jail. Lack of decision makers at the federation level. As a result, don't have a lot of cash, can't make big decisions. What kind of coach do they bring in? Jalal Qadri, a coach that's never coached even the Big Four in Tunisia. He's never coached a major national team. In our preview of the Cup of Nations, the journalist Arfat Hamrouni kept saying, he has a guardian angel because every time we're getting ready to fire him, he wins a big match somehow, some way. Even though, like, for example, against Mali, qualifying to the World Cup, they didn't even score a goal. They went through on an own goal from Mali. So Tunisia, bad administration, bad coach, and honestly, I think the players were a little bit mediocre as well. Tunisia has very good midfield, decent defense, but their attacking line is aging, and the strikers are subpar compared to the other two. So I would say that the players are mediocre. They're not bad, but they're a little bit mediocre, and I think Tunisia is going to need... in my opinion, they need to hit reset and start everything over again. They need to stabilize the federation level, try to find a little more cash, or use a good local option maybe. Maybe somebody like ASFAR Rabat's Nasruddin Nabi, maybe somebody like Radi Jaidi. There are very good Tunisian coaches all over the place if you're going to use a local option. So stabilize the federation, get a good coach in, and then start producing those players and start making a run. But right now, I think Tunisia's performance was the most predictable out of all the North African nations. Looking back on it now, I can't believe we even thought that they would get out of the group stages. I think the only reason we expected them to maybe get out of the group stages was because 16 out of 24 teams get out of the group stages, and they're not one of the worst 8 teams in Africa. And the other reason is, Tunisia are kind of, they find ways to do it, Like, they find ways to get to the quarterfinals or the semifinals, even if they're not as good as the other heavyweights. They have that intangibles. They have that fighting spirit about them. Finally, let's look at Egypt. Egypt, the administratively, it's not like the team was lacking anything, so we can say they're good. Coaching, not bad in my opinion, but mediocre. And players good, yeah. They also had untimely injuries like Morocco, who they were missing Ziyech, and Egypt were obviously missing Mohamed Salah, their best and most important player. But I don't think Egypt deserved to go out in the round of 16. Remember, they went out in penalties against DR Congo. DR Congo went off to have a very good run at this African Cup of Nations. That's razor thin, right? Egypt, it could have been them that made it to the semifinals again. So I think that's where the little bit of luck, they didn't have that in their formula maybe. Let's say Morocco were lacking a little bit of luck with injuries, but Algeria and Tunisia I don't think deserve to make it to the next round. So again, when you look at those formulas, can we make a sweeping generalization about all of the North African teams and say that they're all in decline? I don't think so, because everybody's situation is so different. Algeria and Morocco have really strong federations. Now they should both have good coaches, as Algeria made a coaching switch. They have good players. So for me, it would be a shock to see Algeria and Morocco not perform well at the next Cup of Nations, especially considering the fact that it's in North Africa. Tunisia, if they don't get things under control, I can see them continuing to decline. Egypt, I'm worried about, because the economic situation in Egypt is very bad at the moment. The federation doesn't have as much money. So the administrative side of things is sliding down. The coaching that they hired, Hussam Hassan, he's a character. He's well respected because of his playing past, but he's yet to prove that he can coach such a big national team or such big players like Mohamed Salah. So the coaching, I'm very worried about, and that could also be bad. And not to mention some of your best players are aging like Mohamed Salah. So Egypt is a side, Egypt and Tunisia I'm more worried about than Algeria and Morocco. What about the clubs? Why has it only been Esperance de Tunis and Al Ahly that qualified to the knockout stages of the African Champions League? 2 teams this year. Last year, 6 teams. What's more representative of the quality of North African sides? Well, I'm going to argue that it's probably somewhere in between. This year, what people don't realize is that there were less North African teams even in the group stages. Why? Étoile du Sahel from Tunisia, they knocked out CS Constantine from Algeria, and then in the next round, the second round, Étoile du Sahel knocks out AS FAR Rabat, the league leaders in Morocco right now. So the North African teams cannibalized each other a little bit in the qualifying rounds leading into this CAF Champions League. So 2 teams, especially Rabat. I think Rabat could have done very, very well. They're league leaders right now. 2 teams that sort of cannibalized one another with Étoile du Sahel. What about the other teams? Wydad Casablanca had a very, very tough off-field issue, right? The president, Saïd Nassiri, was dragged into this drug trafficking operation, and he's being accused of all kinds of things, which obviously everything is alleged right now at the moment. But if you look at the results, right after he was accused and right after this was made public, they would lose, 4 or 5 matches. Them losing to Juan and Galaxy, I believe, came before that, but that was like a big faux pas as well. And they still, it still took to the last day. They still finished with the same number of points as Simba. It still took to the last day to eliminate them. So, when you see things like that, when you see that teams cannibalized one another, I don't think 2 is representative of the North African side's quality, but I don't think 6, which was what it was last year, 6 out of 8 teams, is also representative. I would argue that 4 to 5 teams in the quarterfinals is probably North Africa's true representation, because North African clubs still have the most amount of money in general. They still have pretty good coaching in general and decent players as well. When I say all of this, I don't want to take away credit from teams like ASEC Mimosa, who have played wonderful defense. I thought they took it to Wydad Casablanca, even though they only lost 1-0 with a lot of substitutes. They have a coach, Julien Chevalier, who's been there for 5 years now. A lot of stability, and they've been producing so many great players. Players like Oumar Diakite, who was, one of the heroes of the Ivorian team, or Karim Konate, another young player, one of the best young players coming out of Africa at the moment. So they're still producing a lot of great talent. Last year they made it to the final or semifinal. I think semifinal of the CAF Confederation Cup. And this year they're in the knockout stages. So this isn't a fluke. So credit to Azek Mimosa. Credit to the Tanzanian sides, Simba Nyanga. They have millionaires who are investing in their club. And for them, it's not just for political influence. People care about these clubs in Tanzania. These two clubs, maybe to the detriment of the rest of the league, they sort of, overshadow the rest of the Tanzanian clubs. But people care about those clubs, Simba and Yanga. And because they're so important, they do receive a lot of investment. It's like the Egyptian clubs, Ahli and Zamalek. So for me, it's not a surprise to see these two clubs in the knockout stages. And I could see at least one of them continuing to make the knockout stages, as has been the case really for the last 4 or 5 years. So credit to Azek, credit to Simba and Yanga. Sundowns, we don't need to talk about. Mazembe seem to be making a comeback. All of these teams seem to be here for the long term. Also, teams like Horoya and Guinea, who weren't in this edition or the previous edition, and maybe one or two more South African clubs. So that's not to say that North African sides are going to continue dominating in the knockout stages, and they're going to be. I don't think there's going to be 6 teams, but I don't think there's going to be 2 teams. I think the reality is probably somewhere in between. So to recap, I think it's a little bit premature to say all North African sides are in decline. I think with the national teams, there might be 2 teams that might be in decline, Tunisia and Egypt, but those are for very specific reasons. The other 2, Morocco and Algeria, I could see continuing to improve. As for the club sides, Al Ahly is always going to be Al Ahly. Wydad is always going to be Wydad as soon as they stabilize their administrative level. Esperance is always going to be Esperance. So you can at least rely on 3 of those clubs, right? And then you're always going to have these teams like Rabat this year, who are league leaders, or Raja Casablanca, who when they're having a good season. In Algeria next year, look out for Mouloudia Club of Algiers, who are league leaders in Algeria now with incredible players, many Algerian internationals like Youssef Belaili. So I think I would be very, very shocked to see only 2 North African sides in the knockout stages next year. If that is the case, I'll eat my humble pie and you guys can give it to me. But that's something that we're going to have to determine next year. Until then, I cannot wait to see the rest of this CAF Champions League edition. It's very, very exciting. I'm going to try to get to a match, maybe an Esperance de Tunis match in the knockout stages and hopefully vlog that. The draw for the quarterfinals is on March 13th. So just a week and change away from now. And of course, we're going to continue to break that down here on the African Five-A-Side podcast. So thanks for listening. Let me know what you think. Are North African sides in decline? If so, why? Justify it. Don't just say, yeah, they're in decline. And if not, why as well? I'd also be interested to hear your thoughts. I really, really love all the comments, especially from a lot of these Sundown fans who were hurt that I said that they haven't been playing